Some stories don't start with monsters. They start with someone who looks normal, someone you wouldn't notice, someone you might even trust. In the 1970s, young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. At first, there were no answers, just empty rooms, just families waiting for phone calls that never came. The name Ted Bundy would come later, and when it did, it would change how people looked at fear, at trust, and at the idea of evil hiding in plain sight. This is not a story about fame. It's not a story about headlines. It's a story about what happens when the worst kind of danger looks just like everyone else. Back in the early 1970s, Ted Bundy was the kind of person you wouldn't pay attention to. If he walked past you on the street, there was nothing about him that would make you stop or look twice. He looked like a normal student, someone busy with his own life, someone who fit into the crowd without trying. Around that time, young women began to disappear in Washington state. At first, these stories didn't feel connected. A name here, another one there, families waiting for news and hoping for phone calls that never came. It's easy to forget now, but back then most people didn't wake up thinking there was one person behind all of it. They just saw separate tragedies and tried to make sense of each one on its own. Bundy was living right in the middle of this. He was going to school, meeting people, talking about his plans, and moving through the same places everyone else did. To the people around him, he didn't look like a threat. He looked ordinary, and because of that, nobody had a real reason to be afraid of him. Some of the women who disappeared had crossed paths with someone who seemed safe enough in the moment. There was no big scene, no warning that something was about to go wrong, just a short conversation or a small decision that didn't feel dangerous at the time. And then suddenly, someone didn't come home. For families and friends, the waiting was the worst part. At first, there was hope. Maybe she left. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe there would be a call. But as days turned into weeks, that hope started to wear thin, and something heavier took its place. Only later did people begin to understand that these weren't just sad, unrelated stories. Only later did it become clear that someone had been moving through all of this quietly, leaving questions behind and very few answers. This story doesn't start with sirens or headlines. It starts with a man who could sit next to you, talk to you, and walk away, and you still wouldn't remember his face the next day. And that's what made him so dangerous. To understand how Ted Bundy ended up becoming who he was, you have to go back to the beginning, long before anyone was looking for him or saying his name on the news. He was born in 1946 in Vermont, and from the start, his life was complicated in ways that weren't talked about much. His mother, Louise Cowell, was young and not married, and at that time that still came with a lot of shame and quiet judgment. For years, Bundy grew up believing that his grandparents were his parents and that his real mother was his sister. Nobody really sat him down and explained this in a clear way. It was just something that stayed in the background, confusing and half-hidden. Later, Louise took him and moved to Washington state to try to start over. She eventually married a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy, and that's where Ted got the last name everyone would come to know. From the outside, it looked like a normal family trying to build a stable life, but it never quite worked. The marriage didn't last, and Ted never seemed to feel close to his stepfather. As a kid and later as a teenager, he wasn't known for causing trouble. He wasn't loud or wild, and he wasn't the kind of person teachers were always worried about. He was more quiet, more closed off, and often kept to himself. In school, he did fine. Not great, not terrible, just enough to get by without standing out too much. People who knew him back then sometimes said he felt a little distant, like he was always holding something back. Still, nothing about him made anyone think he would grow up to be dangerous. If you met him in those years, you probably would have just thought he was a bit awkward and moved on.
As he got older, he started caring more and more about how he looked to other people. He wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to feel important. That's part of why studying law appealed to him later on. It sounded like proof that he was going somewhere, that he wasn't just another guy drifting through life. At the same time, his personal life never felt settled. The truth about his childhood, the questions about his real father, and the strange way he had grown up stayed with him. He didn't deal with any of that in a healthy way. It just sat there, mixed with a lot of frustration and quiet anger that nobody else could really see. From the outside, though, he still looked like a young man trying to build a future. He was going to school, meeting people, and doing what a lot of others were doing in the late 1960s and early 1970s. There was still nothing that made anyone think his life would turn into a story people would talk about for decades. That part was still ahead of him.
By the time Ted Bundy was in his early 20s, he was working hard on the picture he wanted other people to see. He was living in Washington State, going to college, and talking a lot about the future he planned to have. Law school came up often, partly because it sounded serious and important, and partly because he liked how it made him look in front of others. Around this time, he met a woman named Elizabeth Klopfer, usually called Liz. They started a relationship, and from the outside, it looked like a normal life taking shape. They lived together for a while, shared everyday problems, and tried to build something that felt stable. Liz had a young daughter, and Bundy played the role of a caring boyfriend in front of them. To neighbors and friends, he didn't look dangerous. He looked like someone trying to settle down and get his life moving in the right direction. But under that surface, things were never as steady as they seemed. Bundy moved back and forth between confidence and insecurity. He cared a lot about how people saw him, and when he felt ignored or looked down on, it hit him harder than he wanted to admit. School didn't always go the way he hoped. Jobs came and went, and he often felt like other people were moving ahead while he was stuck in place. Liz would later say that he could be calm and kind one moment, and distant and hard to read the next. There were times when it felt like he was somewhere else, lost in his own thoughts. Still, none of this looked like something that should set off alarms. It looked like a young man under pressure trying to figure out who he was and where he was going. He even did volunteer work in politics and on a crisis hotline, which only made him seem more responsible and trustworthy to the people around him. If you asked someone back then what they thought of Ted Bundy, most would probably say he was serious, a bit ambitious, and maybe a little strange, but nothing more than that. What nobody could see was that his private world was already moving in a very different direction, and that the gap between who he wanted to be and who he really was kept getting wider. That gap didn't stay quiet forever. In 1974, the Seattle area slowly began to understand that something was very wrong. At first, it looked like a few sad disappearances that didn't have much to do with each other. Families waited for news, friends held on to hope, and for a while people told themselves that there had to be some explanation that didn't involve the worst possible answer. One of the first names was Linda Ann Healy, a college student who vanished from her basement bedroom in January. She hadn't packed her things, and she hadn't said goodbye to anyone. Most of what she owned was still there, which made it clear she hadn't just decided to leave. Months later, remains connected to her were found in a wooded area outside the city. Investigators could say with certainty that she had been taken and killed, and that her body had been moved far from where she disappeared. Years later, Bundy admitted he was responsible for her abduction and murder, and investigators concluded that sexual assault was part of what had happened to her. By summer, the situation became even harder to ignore. On July 14, 1974, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund disappeared from Lake Sammamish State Park in the middle of a busy day. Witnesses saw them talking with a man who introduced himself as Ted and said he needed help. They walked away with him, one after the other, and that was the last time anyone saw them alive. Weeks later, skeletal remains were found in a wooded area near Issaquah. Through dental records, investigators identified them as Ott and Naslund. What had started as two missing persons cases was now clearly something else. Years later, Bundy admitted that he had abducted both women, sexually assaulted them, and killed them. He also admitted that during this period of his crimes, he sometimes returned to places where bodies had been left and committed sexual acts with the bodies after death, until time and decay made that impossible. This wasn't rumor or guesswork, it came from his own later statements, and it matched what investigators were seeing across several cases. The pattern was becoming clear. These were not accidents, and they were not sudden, uncontrolled acts. Someone was doing this on purpose, and someone was doing it more than once. For the families, the experience followed the same painful path. First there was hope, then there was waiting, and finally there was the moment when hope ran out and the truth took its place. By the end of 1974, it no longer made sense to talk only about people who were missing. Young women were being abducted, assaulted, and murdered, and their bodies were being left in remote areas. Whoever was responsible was still free, and that meant the story wasn't close to being over. It was only beginning to take its real shaping. By the end of 1974, the police were no longer asking whether the disappearances were connected. That part was already clear. The real problem was finding out who was behind them, and that turned out to be much harder. This is where Elizabeth Klopfer, usually called Liz, becomes an important part of the story. She wasn't trying to play detective, and she wasn't looking for attention. She was living with Ted Bundy, and little by little, things about him started to bother her in ways she couldn't ignore anymore. There wasn't one big moment that changed everything. It was a lot of small ones, stories that didn't quite line up, mood changes she couldn't explain, that uneasy feeling you get when something doesn't make sense, even if you can't point to one clear reason why. And then there were the news reports, the name Ted, and the description of the car. After a while, it became too close to home to pretend it was all just bad luck. So she made a call to the police and told them that her boyfriend might be someone they should look at. That didn't turn Bundy into the main suspect overnight. The police were getting many tips, and most of them went nowhere. But Liz's call mattered, because now Bundy wasn't just an idea. He was a real person in a real file, someone investigators could check, compare, and keep an eye on. When they started doing that, some things fit too well to ignore. He lived in the right area. He moved around a lot. He had the kind of schedule that made it easy to be in different places without raising questions. And he owned a Volkswagen, which by now wasn't just a random detail anymore. Still, none of this was enough to stop him. At this stage, the case was built on patterns and suspicions, not on the kind of proof that could end everything in one move. Bundy was careful enough to stay just outside what could be clearly shown in court. On the surface, his life didn't change much. He kept going to school. He kept talking about his plans. He kept acting like someone who had nothing to hide. But now, there were people quietly watching him, checking where he went and trying to see if he would make a mistake. For Liz, this was a slow and painful time. She wasn't watching a stranger. She was watching someone she cared about, knowing that if her instincts were right, the truth was worse than anything she wanted to believe. This is the moment where the story starts to tighten. Bundy is no longer just a shadow moving through other people's lives. He is becoming a suspect with a name, a face, and a file that keeps getting thicker, even if nobody yet has the one piece of proof that can stop him for good. Even as suspicion slowly started to gather around Ted Bundy, life on the surface kept moving. He was still going to school, still talking about the future, and still acting like a man who had nothing to worry about. But in the background, the pressure was building, and so was the risk. In June 1974, another young woman, Jorgan Hawkins, disappeared after leaving a fraternity house at the University of Washington. She was last seen walking down an alley near campus, and then she was gone. There were no clear witnesses who could explain what happened in that moment, and there was no easy trail to follow. Years later, her remains were found in the same general area near Issaquah that had already been tied to other victims, which placed her firmly inside the same pattern. By now, the area around Issaquah and Taylor Mountain was becoming a quiet map of what had happened. Different dates and different lives, but the same ending: abduction, sexual assault, murder, and, as Bundy would later admit, in some cases, a return to the bodies after death. For investigators, the picture was getting sharper, even if the case was still hard to prove in a way that would hold up in court. For Bundy, things were getting uncomfortable. His name had been mentioned. His car had been mentioned. People were starting to look at him in a way they hadn't before. Not long after this, he made a decision that changed the story again. He left Washington and moved to Utah, telling people it was for school and a fresh start. On the surface, it sounded normal. People move all the time. But in reality, it also meant putting distance between himself and the places where attention was starting to build. The move didn't mean the violence stopped. It meant it was about to continue somewhere else. And that's the dangerous thing about this moment in the story. Washington was slowly closing in, even if it didn't fully realize it yet. Bundy didn't wait to see what would happen. He crossed state lines and carried the same darkness with him into a new place where nobody knew his name and nobody was ready for what was coming. When Ted Bundy moved to Utah, he told people it was about school and a fresh start. On the surface, it sounded normal. People change cities all the time, especially when they're trying to move their lives forward. But nothing about him had really changed, and he didn't leave his old habits behind. Not long after he arrived, a young woman named Carol Daronch was attacked in a mall parking lot in November 1974. A man pretending to be a police officer tried to get her into his car. She fought back, managed to get away, and ran for help. She survived, and that mattered more than anything else in this part of the story, because for the first time, there was someone who could describe what had happened and who had done it. Carol later identified Bundy as the man who attacked her. That didn't just add another accusation to the pile. It gave the police a living witness, someone who could sit in a courtroom and point to him. For the first time, the case wasn't built only on patterns and suspicions. It had a face and a voice attached to it. A few months later, in January 1975, another young woman, Corinne Campbell, disappeared from a hotel in Colorado. Her body was later found, and the case fit the same general pattern investigators had already seen before. By now, the map had changed, but the story itself hadn't. In August 1975, Bundy was arrested in Utah after being stopped by police. In his car, officers found items that didn't belong to him and didn't have innocent explanations. It still wasn't the kind of case that could close everything at once, but it was enough to hold him and to start pushing much harder than before. The trial for the attack on Carol Daronch became a turning point. She testified about what had happened, and the jury believed her. In 1976, Bundy was convicted and sent to prison in Utah. For the first time, he wasn't just a suspect moving in the background. He was a convicted criminal. From the outside, it might have looked like the story was finally slowing down. A dangerous man was behind bars, and people could breathe a little easier. But this wasn't that kind of story. Bundy didn't accept being trapped. He watched how the system worked, learned the routines, and looked for weak spots. He spent time in law libraries and courtrooms, helping with his own defense and quietly preparing for something that almost nobody around him was ready for. Because what came next wasn't another trial or another appeal. It was an escape. After his conviction in Utah, Bundy was sent to Colorado to stand trial for the murder of Corinne Campbell. By this point, he was no longer just a problem for one state. Different places were looking at him, and the cases were starting to stack up. The system was finally taking him seriously, even if it was still moving slower than many people wanted. Once again, Bundy decided to represent himself in court. It sounded strange, but it gave him something he wanted very much: access. Access to law libraries, to paperwork, and to parts of buildings that most prisoners never get to see. While everyone else was focused on dates and motions, he was paying attention to routines, doors, and moments when nobody was watching closely. In June 1977, during a pre-trial hearing in Aspen, he asked to use the law library. A guard took him to a room in the courthouse and left him there. At some point, Bundy saw his chance. He jumped out of a second-floor window and ran. For a few days, he was free. The escape made headlines, and the search didn't take long. He was caught not far away, tired and injured, and taken back into custody. It looked like a short, desperate move that had failed. But that wasn't the end of it. The second escape was planned more carefully. In December 1977, Bundy was being held in the Garfield County Jail in Colorado. Over time, he lost weight on purpose so he could slip through a small opening in the ceiling of his cell. One night, he climbed into the space above the jail, moved through it, dropped down into the apartment of the chief jailer, changed into street clothes, and walked out the front door. This time, he didn't just try to hide nearby. He got on a bus and headed all the way to Florida. For weeks, nobody knew where he was. The idea that a man facing serious charges had simply disappeared was hard to accept, but that was exactly what had happened. The system that was supposed to keep him locked up had failed, and now he was free again, with nothing to lose. When he arrived in Florida, he didn't disappear into the woods or try to live off the grid. He blended in. He went to bars. He walked around like someone starting over in a new place. On the surface, it almost looked like he had pulled it off. But inside, nothing had changed. And in January 1978, in Tallahassee, that would become clear in a way that shocked the entire country. When Ted Bundy arrived in Florida at the beginning of 1978, he was already a fugitive, even if most people around him had no idea who he really was. He had escaped from jail, crossed the country, and tried to disappear into a place where nobody knew his name. For a short time, it almost worked, but nothing about him had really changed, and the same violence followed him there. On January 15th, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. The attack was sudden and brutal. 2 women were killed and 2 others were seriously injured but survived. The shock spread far beyond the campus because this was a place where people felt safe, and the danger came without warning. A few weeks later, a 12-year-old girl was taken from her school in Florida. When her body was later found, the case changed everything. This was no longer just about an escaped prisoner or a series of attacks. The murder of a child forced the system to move faster and with much more pressure. By this point, Bundy was tired and careless in ways he hadn't been before. On February 15, 1978, he was arrested in Pensacola after a traffic stop that turned into a struggle with police. This time, there was no smooth talk and no quick way out. He was back in custody, and Florida was not going to let him slip away again. The trials that followed were long and very public. Bundy chose to take part in his own defense, turning the courtroom into something that sometimes felt more like a performance than a search for quiet justice. But behind all of that, the evidence kept building and the verdicts were clear. He was convicted of 3 murders in Florida and sentenced to death. That's the official number on paper. 3. But it was never the real number. Over time, Bundy admitted to killing 30 people. Even then, many investigators believed he was not telling the full truth. Some thought he was leaving things out. Others believed he might not even remember every victim himself, or that he simply didn't want to say everything out loud. What most of them agreed on was this: the real number was almost certainly higher than 30. There are cases that were never fully solved. There are names that were never officially added to a charge sheet. There are families who never got clear answers. The exact total will probably never be known. Bundy spent the next years on death row, filing appeals, giving interviews, and changing his story more than once. In 1989, the appeals ran out. He was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside the prison, people gathered for different reasons. Some were angry, some felt relief, some just wanted to see the end of a story that had followed the country for more than a decade. Inside, the life of a man who had caused enormous damage came to an end. But the story doesn't really end there. It ends with the empty spaces he left behind, with families who never got their daughters back, with survivors who had to carry what happened to them for the rest of their lives, and with a number that will probably always stay uncertain because some crimes leave behind more questions than answers. Officially, he was convicted of 3 murders. He admitted to 30, and the truth is that the real number was almost certainly higher. That's not a mystery that can be solved anymore. What can be done is remembering that this story is not about a man who wanted attention or fame. It's about the damage he caused, and about the people whose lives were taken long before anyone knew his name. And that's where this story ends. Thanks for staying with me until the end. If you enjoyed this kind of episode, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It really helps me make more stories like this. And I'll see you in the next one.